This is a special bonus edition of Judaism Unbound. Dan and Lex on the Contact Chai podcast. Welcome back, everyone. This is Lex. Dan is not joining for this introductory part of our bonus episode, but he will very much be in the body of this bonus episode, which, what is it, Lex? Great question. This bonus episode coming to you off schedule, not on a Friday, but rather on a Tuesday, is us as guests on a different podcast, a favorite of ours, Contact Chai, which is a podcast brought to you by Mishkan Chicago, a great organization. And we joined their host, Lizzie Heidemann, for a great conversation about the counting of the Omer, this 7-week period between Passover and Shavuot, which just wrapped up at Shavuot. And we talked about all sorts of other things too, including the history of our own podcast. It was a lot of fun. We hope that you'll listen in. And I'll just leave the intro at that. Listen into this great episode. We haven't altered it at all. This is the same as on their feed. And we hope that you'll subscribe to their podcast called Contact Chai, C-H-A-I. And with that, just tune on in. Here's our guest appearance on their podcast.
You're listening to Contact Chai, a podcast from Mishkan Chicago exploring inspired, down-to-earth Judaism in conversation. I'm your host, Rabbi Lizzie Heidemann, and we are in the 7th and final week of our Omer series featuring spiritual entrepreneurs, people who are bringing the wisdom of their own lived experience into their professional lives and carving new paths, making unique and much-needed impact in the world. In this extended episode, I speak with Dan Liebenson and Lex Rofberg, the hosts of Judaism Unbound, a renowned and wildly popular podcast in the Jewish podcast universe that analyzes the most pressing and fascinating issues for 21st century American Jews and Judaism. A little bit of background on Dan and Lex before we begin. Dan is the founder and president of the Institute for the Next Jewish Future. He's been the executive director of the University of Chicago Hillel and the director of new initiatives at Harvard Hillel. He's a 2009 Avichai Fellow, which is sort of like the Jewish MacArthur Fellowship, and he has received the Richard M. Joel Exemplar of Excellence Award, Hillel's highest professional honor. In 2010, he was named a Jewish Chicagoan of the Year by Chicago Jewish News. May its memory be a blessing. He is a Harvard alum, a lawyer, a writer, and a translator of The Orchard, a book by renowned Israeli novelist Yochi Brandis, and the translation editor of The Secret Book of Kings by the same author. Lex serves as Strategic Initiatives Coordinator at the Institute for the Next Jewish Future. He is a graduate of Brown University and a writer featured in JTA, My Jewish Learning, Jewish Currents, Shema Journal, New Voices, and others. He completed a 2-year education fellowship at the Institute for Southern Jewish Life and joined the Judaism Unbound team in 2015. He has a certificate in Interfaith Family Jewish Engagement from Hebrew College and is ordained as a rabbi by the Alliance for Jewish Renewal, Aleph. Lex is an educator and an activist in Jewish movements for justice, which have included If Not Now and Never Again Action. As you will hear in this episode, both Dan and Lex are deep thinkers and envelope pushers, interested in the boundless possibilities of Jewish learning, living, and thinking. Beyond their extensive bios, Dan and Lex bring curiosity and imagination to their show, and in turn, bring curiosity and imagination to their Judaism and to the Judaism they hold out as a possibility for others to explore. Our conversation was invigorating and inspiring, and I'm thrilled to share it with you now as we complete our series on the Omer with our final theme. This week is Malchut, kingship or kingdom. And if that word doesn't totally resonate with you, not to worry. We'll explore that in this episode, and you're not alone. In fact, you have generations behind you. Take a listen. This whole series we've been doing has been with spiritual entrepreneurs. And what I've sort of meant by that, being a spiritual entrepreneur, is, taking the experiences of one's life and channeling them into creating something new, which requires sort of being in the world, looking at the landscape of what exists and recognizing that something is missing that you uniquely have the ability to change. So I'm wondering, when you looked out at the world, what did you see missing, and why was Judaism Unbound the answer?
I mean, I think that Judaism Unbound was a little bit of an accident, because actually the original plan was to write a book, and I don't know. I think that I just don't like to write books. And so, as an excuse, I said we need to do more research. And then we said, let's do it in the form of a podcast because, more important people will be willing to talk to us if we can, get them publicity. I mean, I think that was kind of true. But then then it turned out that the podcast took off and was something that people apparently wanted. And I think to me, that's the answer to your question a little bit. Like, it's less something that we saw. I mean, I could probably tell you some things that I saw or thought back then that were missing, but I think a lot about this quote by Henry Ford that Steve Jobs used to quote a lot, which is that if I'd asked the people what they wanted, they would have said a faster horse. And I think a lot of people hear that to be kind of dismissive of people. They don't know what they want. They would have just said a faster horse. But I don't think that that's what they're saying. I think that if you listen closely to what they're saying, they're not actually saying they want a faster horse. They're saying they want to get somewhere faster. And Clayton Christensen used to talk about how people think that they need a drill, but actually what they need is a hole. And if you listen carefully to what they need and not to how they say it, then you can kind of imagine a new way of connecting them with what they're looking for. And I think that what was missing for me is an attitude that says we have great respect for the Jews who are not participating in Jewish life. And we believe that they're not participating in Jewish life for a good reason, which is that it's not working for them. And the answer isn't to persuade them that it ought to work better for them. The answer is to change Judaism so that it can solve the need that they have with the raw material that Judaism has. And I think that that's kind of how I would put it together. I don't know, Lex, do you have a different take?
I think it's a good take. I really want to emphasize what you said about sort of accidental. Like, people think we're being modest when we tell this story sometimes, but like and maybe I should, maybe we should tell it less. I don't know. We come off like nudniks, but like when I started working with Dan, which was in 2015, it was basically, okay, we want to have some kind of, Jewish think tank. That would be cool. And, go. That was basically where we were at. And in terms of what it was going to look like, how it was going to operate, anything like that, it was a beautiful, sacred joy to figure that out and actually have no idea. And what I feel so privileged to be the case working with Dan is that that's kind of the spirit he brings to everything he does. We'll try pretty much anything a few times. And the podcast we tried, and like Dan said, we were able to connect with some really fantastic guests early, and it put us on a really great path. I mean, what I think this sort of filled in terms of gaps that may have resonated for people is, folks are busy. Folks working in Jewish life are they're in what they're doing, right? You're a rabbi, you're an executive director, you're an associate, you're whatever you are, if you're like working professionally in Jewish life, or if you're just a lay leader, or if you're just a Jew in the pew, or if you never set foot in the pews, like you are in your organization or set of local organizations sometimes. And it's really hard to be like, oh, how do these pieces fit together across geographies? How does, a synagogue in this place and a social justice organization in a different time zone and, a community engagement project in a third time zone, like how are those interacting with each other? Like there's not really time to do that. People are just, scheduling events with their organizations and doing them. And what I've always loved doing, I've always been sort of up in the clouds and wanting to think about big picture questions. And we've been able to do that with people in all those time zones and in all sorts of different kinds of roles, from the people that have like official leadership positions to often we're proudest of the folks who don't have official leadership positions in Jewish life that we feature. And it's been a pleasure because we do need to ask those bigger questions about how the pieces are fitting together in Jewish life, because it turns out they're often not fitting together. And there's a lot that needs to be fixed, worked on, repaired, improved, started moving forward.
This is so interesting for me to hear. Can I tell you what I thought was the founding impetus for Judaism Unbound? Because this is the role that it played for me. What I thought was, from the two of you who are out-of-the-box thinkers, who are willing to say things that people might be thinking, but aren't able to say in mainstream Jewish spaces, or these are things that, are maybe like 5 or 10 years ahead of their time, or maybe 50 years ahead of their time. Dan, something I've heard you quote, this idea that like the future's already here. It's just not very equally distributed. And so to want to distribute sort of the intellectual culture that, because of where you sit in the world and the circle, the company you keep, and the kinds of conversations that you're able to have in your personal lives, to just be like, yo, let's bring those into a place where more people can benefit from them, and we can show that Judaism is actually, all of these different threads and strands, and bringing it like conversation. I just listened to the episode on psychedelics, like there are probably a lot of Jews who don't know there is a conference on Judaism and psychedelics happening that also. Oh, did you go already?
A couple days. It was, as we record this, it was a couple days ago. It was really great. Hopefully they'll release some stuff to the public afterwards if people want to check out the programming.
So interesting, but also, on issues that people think a lot about and think that they're the only ones who, like, oh, I don't think about God as a man in the sky. I think of, and it's like, great, let's like bring on some theologians and thinkers who, think about God in diverse ways. All of these things, Israel, race, money, so many different topics. I figured your founding impetus was that you kind of subversively wanted to get these conversations out in the open.
I mean, that's not what it was. I think that there is something, though, to the fact of that we felt free. We sort of made ourselves feel free to have whatever conversation needed to be had. And that's partly the order, like the episodes that we had. But it turns out that actually, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about even the way that we do the episode, which is that we record, which is that we record long. And we always tell the guests, like, just let the conversation go where it wants to go, and we'll tighten it up in editing. And there's something about just kind of being liberated to have the conversation that you feel you want to have at that moment, that good things come from that, and I can't say that this was a goal at the beginning, but it definitely feels like something that I've had on my mind for so long now doing the podcast, and I still am struggling to fully get the ideas out, but that I'm more interested in a Jewish future that is the product of the way artists think than the way entrepreneurs think. And I actually think about the early days of Judaism Unbound. That first year, I was much more into Silicon Valley. And some of our early episodes, we were interviewing entrepreneurs and people in Silicon Valley. And I still think there's a lot to that. But now, 5 years later, I'm much more interested in artists, because I feel like we're at this period of Judaism where nobody knows the right business plan for the future. It's not knowable. And unfortunately, in my view, the funding world is not yet full of Medicis, that are basically patrons of the arts, who understand that we have to allow these wild experiments to happen, and at some point something will bubble out of them, and we have to have the faith, and here I really use that word intentionally, the faith that Judaism is good enough, that the raw material is good enough, that if we actually just let people run wild with it, really good things will happen. And one of the critiques that I might have of the funding world, but I don't think that they're the cause, I think that they're just part of the whole process, is that they don't really have enough faith in Judaism to believe that great things will come if we just kind of let things go wild. And instead, they want to have these tight business plans, and I actually worry that leads us to this kind of short-term thinking that's actually not good for the long term of Judaism.
I'm glad we have this recorded, because Dan, I feel like the way you just put that was like crystal clear. I've heard you talk about this, but that was gorgeous. I agree with what Dan said, which is what you described is absolutely part of what we wanted. I don't know that it's what we wanted on day one, but I think by day like 100, we started to realize that was a potential thing, because it's not that we thought nobody would listen, but we realized shortly after we started that like, oh, we actually have a platform here. And so when we feature somebody, it's doing work. And I'm not saying that with like huge ego, right? I just mean that like as a literal fact, it is the case that somebody being on our show and just being who they are, it sends a message that whatever that is kind of officially kosher Jewishly.
Isn't that
Right,
amazing?
yeah,
that like you giving somebody a platform, all of a sudden
right,
they've arrived.
And by the way, there's huge responsibility associated with that too, and like it makes us need to think about who those voices are and featuring different a rich diversity of voices. It's a lot of things, but it's the second that's the case, all of a sudden what you said is true. When we talk about, so one example, let's take I think there's a lot of ways that people feel Jewishly that they think are not Jewish feelings. What I mean by that is people, resent certain parts of the prayer book or resent certain passages in the Torah. And what they think is happening is they think that that's something that they don't like about Judaism, which like on one level, yes, it's true that like that's a part of Judaism, the words of the traditional prayer book, the words of Torah. And it may be the case that you don't like them. It's often the case that I don't like them. What I don't think has been said enough is that feeling of resentment towards the words of the prayer book is actually a Jewish feeling. It's not an anti-Jewish feeling. It is a Jewish feeling. And when you have a series in a podcast that features a whole bunch of people in rapid succession or spread out over a bunch of episodes that are all expressing different frustrations they have with Jewish stuff, but not from a place of, wow, the takeaway is Judaism is bad, but actually the takeaway is that Judaism is something that we care very deeply about and wanna build better versions of. Like that tells people that creates this sense of permission. Like, oh, the project is not actually just taking the Jewish past and sort of polishing it, preserving it in our time. I feel like we think that the project is like to preserve stuff, to maintain stuff, to make sure nothing gets erased, to like, make, whether it's our grandparents' Judaism or our ancestors' long ago Judaism, we think it's about like really being careful and making sure nothing that they did gets erased, which matters. But when the project is, actually, it's a Jewish thing to get frustrated with Jewish things. And we're going to feature all sorts of dissatisfied people. And I'm quoting Dan here. A phrase we used early a lot and which we still use is dissatisfied optimists. Like we want to feature people who are dissatisfied with Judaism as it is, as it has been, and are optimistic in the ways that Dan said, that if we really play around, if we really are ambitious, if we really try something special and many somethings special with Judaism, it will create rich, justice-driven, artistic, creative, beautiful Jewish future. That's sort of now an official Jewish practice. It's an honor that we get to do that. Yeah.
It's like part of the canon. Now that it's been on a podcast, it's like it's part of the, like oral Torah, literally. That brings me to a question, honestly, I was curious about. I wondered if anything is actually like off limits for Judaism Unbound. Has there ever been anything where you're like, no, like Adkan, like up till this point, but actually like, no, that actually doesn't belong in the canon? So
we do get this question here and there as an organization that is called Unbound. I'm a big math guy. And so when I get asked if there are limits, if there are boundaries, I flash to the literal mathematical concept of limits from like high school calculus class. And I also flash to one of my Rebbes, Katie Heron, whose famous quote in Mean Girls is, "The limit does not exist." When I had my math tests and we were learning about limits, sorry to really geek out. I'm not that sorry, but like for folks that are bored by this, there will be other things. The most common answers to the quizzes, the questions that I had in the quiz about what's the limit of this function were either infinity, negative infinity, so like going up for eternity, going down for eternity, or the limit does not exist. So it actually doesn't see, like that's the literal structure of our world, right? Like that mathematical functions that are the foundation of our world often don't have limits. And so we're somehow uncomfortable with the idea that Judaism wouldn't have limits or that other parts of our society wouldn't be constrained, restricted, limited in some way. But it's very much a physical part of our universe that lots of things don't have limits. So my real answer is no, there's not a limit to certainly not a limit to like the topics we would discuss on the show. I will say there are certainly voices that we don't seek to feature. And those voices, to be honest, are more likely to be the ones that are already centered in Jewish life that everybody sort of treats as in the bounds of the conversation.
Like basically the ones setting the norms by their very existence.
Right. Like those folks don't need a greater platform. And I'm not going to say we've never had sort of mainstream voices on the show. We have. I mean, we've not very many, but we've even had some Orthodox guests here and there. I think the role that we play in sort of the ecology of Jewish organizations, institutions, is specifically to be elevating those that don't have those platforms in other ways. So that's what we try to do. So I wouldn't say that's necessarily a limit. We don't have a veto around people that are heads of like Jewish federations or synagogues, but it's not who we primarily reach out to.
Yeah, I mean, Lex, you said that beautifully and better than I would have if I had spoken first. So I appreciate that, because I was trying to, my impulse is always to say like that we don't have limits, and I don't think there should be limits, because I always experience people making limits in ways that limit out the people I love. And so what I'm really, but when I think about it, like we do actually have limits. Like Lex is saying, we don't feature on our podcast the people who are defining a lot of the norms. And like Lex says, largely because we don't have to. They have plenty of other platforms. But we also don't feature certain folks who might be breaking boundaries on what we might call the right? Like I feel comfortable saying that we have no boundaries on the left. And most of the Jewish world has boundaries on the left and not on the right. And I'm not claiming that we are defining all of Judaism in our space. Like, we don't make that claim, and I don't want that responsibility. So like when you said that by having somebody on our show, we're sort of making them kosher, I think that's interesting. That's an interesting way to think about it. I think that what I want is that we'll make them kosher for other Jews that are like them, right? Meaning that we want people to feel like, oh, I like psychedelics. Like, I thought that wasn't something that was Jewish. And all of a sudden, oh, here's a rabbi who's doing a psychedelic, and there's a Jewish psychedelics conference that's getting 1,000 people there. Like, I guess, wow, there really is a place for me. Like, I love that. I don't mind it if there are people who are in the norm world, like who those things become kosher. I thought psychedelics were bad, or I thought intermarriage was bad, but now I've heard all these voices, or I didn't know anything about trans folks, and now I've heard all these voices, and wow, there's a lot there, and that's so great. And so I'm very thrilled when that kind of thing happens, although that's not really our objective. Our objective is to create this alternate Jewish universe, for all the people who struggle to be part of the existing landscape. And, then the question is like, and then what? And in my fantasy version of this, we create a new Jewish ecosystem outside of that world where the norm defining people are. And we aren't against them. We're just not with them. It's just a different ecosystem. Now, our listeners don't have to agree with me about that aspiration, but my personal fantasy is I'd like to go to a desert island with all of those folks and create something new. And, so that's something maybe that we could discuss a little bit. But I also want to say, like, quite firmly that we do have limits because we don't have any space for racism or transphobia or homophobia or any of those kind of things. Like, and so, it's not right to say that we're unbound in that regard.
Thank you. Beautifully stated by both of you in your different ways. So now, since you were geeking out about math, let's geek out about Hebrew a little, and maybe Kabbalah. Nice. So we're in the 7th week. We're going to be in the 7th week of the Omer. So the 7th and final week. And I don't want to say too much about this because I want to leave it to you, Dan, who has translated complex books from Hebrew into English, and Lex, you who are an ordained rabbi and very familiar with the Sfirot and the Kabbalistic system. And so this week is Malchut, which is often translated as kingship or kingdom, which I find wholly unrelatable. But I'm wondering so first of all, how you understand this week, like the significance of this concept, how you can make this concept relatable, and what this has to do with your work.
I mean, I'll start with something, and then I don't know if it's like responsive, and then I'll let Lex talk about the digital space and other things, because that's what Lex is good at. But like, I've been thinking a lot about sort of God. And if we're talking about, Malchut relating to God, like God is something that I've really struggled to have any kind of real relationship with as a concept. And recently on our podcast, we were having an interview with, and it actually hasn't gone up yet, with Binya Koatz, who is a wonderful trans teacher of Jewish texts and Talmud and things like that. And I've been probing this question of like, if you're trans, like how can you relate to this Judaism that was designed for people not like you, and which didn't acknowledge people like you? And how do you relate to that and say, I still feel part of this, I want to be part of this? And Binya gave an extremely wonderful answer that I can't and shouldn't reproduce all of it, so stay tuned. It'll be on Judaism Unbound in a few weeks. But one of the things that she said was something like this: when the God that I believe in is the oneness of all things, then I know that I am inside of it, or something like that, right? And like for the first time in my life, I had this experience of like, oh, well, maybe this actually means something to me. Maybe I can find a way to wrap my mind around this quality of God that we imagine as this kind of aboveness. But if it's fundamentally about the unity of everything, and that means we're all actually part of that kingship. I don't know what's the gender neutral version of king, royalty. That okay, there's something that I can relate to, and I bring that up because I, as a cisgender white Ashkenazi man, straight, etc., right? Like I learned this from a trans woman. I learned this from the trans experience in my poor way that I've learned it, and I'm learning it. But like I could only have learned a way of relating to something so fundamental to Judaism through an encounter with somebody who's sort of not seen as central to the tradition until recently, right? I just feel like there's something there, and like I don't know if that's an answer to your question. It's something that I'm really kind of like struggling. But if we're talking about like Kabbalistic, attributes of God and struggling with those during this particular 7-week period, like that's where I'm living right now.
I love that. Thank you. Lex, what are you going to say?
Yeah. So I love the frankness. I love that you named that Malchut as, this kingliness is very unrelatable. I want to really say loudly, like, it's a problem if Malchut is unrelatable. Malchut, in the world of these Svirot, in the world of these, different emanations or whatever word, like parts, characteristics of God, Malchut is supposed to be the most relatable. Malchut's at sort of the bottom of this graphic, and it's like the part of godliness that is supposed to be most connectable to human experience. It ties to the idea of Shekhinah. Here we are talking to Mishkan Chicago, which is built on the same Hebrew root as Shekhinah, like God having some kind of dwelling or presence on earth. And so if Malchut is not relatable, that's serious in a way that it would be bad for any of the Svirot, any of these ideas to not be relatable. But that's a sign to me that we need to really think through that sphere. And I would say, like, we actually have some precedents for this. I think a lot of people before us were uncomfortable with Malchut, and that's why they did this mapping of, we're going to talk about Shekhinah. We're going to talk about this beautiful feminine attribute of God. We're going to go down that. We're going to think about this other idea of what that root of dwelling of God, sort of having this physicality on earth in some sense. I think that, once again, that's a moment where I'd say us feeling that it's unrelatable isn't us sort of disconnecting from a Jewish thing. It's us connecting to all of the people in the past who have struggled to connect to ideas of kingliness.
Beautiful.
Turns out Tanakh actually has all sorts of problems with kingliness. Like one of the core thesis statements of the Book of Kings seems to be that human kings aren't so good. And so I would take that to the next level and say the whole metaphor, the whole idea of kingliness is not ideal, even as applied to God, which maybe that's different from how the authors of those books meant it. But like, I think we should just use that starting point of, Malchut isn't so relatable, not as something to fight against and like rehabilitate, but say, it's not relatable. There's a bunch of others who have felt it's unrelatable. They've gone this direction of Shekhinah, of the idea of dwelling, cool. Yeah, I hope that's a little bit coherent, but I've found this tendency with the Sphirot, especially with this period of the Omer, to go through and each day really be like, wow, this day is so special and so positive. And it's not that I want to be just a contrarian and say these are not beautiful meaning-making maps, but I want us to be able to say, whether it's with Malchut or with Chesed or with, I'm sure you've had beautiful conversations about these other Sphirot, I want to be able to say, like, this one's kind of abstract for me. I don't get it. Like,
right.
I don't know what Hod is supposed to. I'll be honest. Like, I've spent a lot of time with like some of the middle ones, Hod, Yesod. I don't fully feel like I have a deep, resonant connection with them. I've tried. I'm not sure exactly what they mean for me. Malchut, I actually think I have a little more, but not on the kingliness front. I'm not interested in the Malchut Yod part of Rosh Hashanah, where it's all this majesty, all this king, all this. I mean, it's nice that we have the shofar blast that's associated with that. I'm interested in the shofar blast part. I'm not interested in all the liturgy about God as king, God as that stuff.
I appreciate your saying that like, right, there are kind of a couple paths to take. One is just, sort of one thing you're suggesting, which is like, don't fight the feeling. Just like acknowledge it. Be like, wow, I'm probably in good company with a lot of people who also have a hard time relating to hierarchical concepts of divinity. And like, rather than try and rehabilitate the concept, just recognize like, maybe this one doesn't work for me. That's okay. There's a lot of other things that do. My tendency, this is, sort of showing my cards, and this won't surprise probably either of you, is like, I feel like like a forager, like maybe an archaeologist. Like Judah Lev, my kid, just got this block. It's basically like a block of soap, and inside is a fossil. And so he has to like chip away at the soap to get to the fossil. And I feel like that's what I'm doing with Judaism, is like kind of chipping away at the stuff that I can't relate to be like, yeah, but there's something in here, like, let's get it. So with Malchut, here's the way I've been translating it, is mostly like this world. It's finding holiness in this world. Just to your point, Lex, about like all of the higher sort of Sphirot on the map being a little more ethereal. I've been like, okay, yeah, and Malchut is the closest to the earth. It's like about finding God's presence, or whatever that oneness Dan talked about in this world. So like, what does that look like in my life? And what I was thinking about with the two of you, and actually during this past year in COVID, I feel like you all were very well positioned to think about Jewish space in a way that other people, groups, synagogues had like not yet been thinking about Jewish space, but they sure are now. And that is to say, like, digital space, the Malchut, the kingdom of the world of the internet, and how ideas and traditions and rituals and people sort of connect in this space. And I wondered actually if you could share some of your gleanings from this past year, any big hot takes that, you've sort of developed just through doing what you do.
Dangerous to ask us for big hot takes.
Well,
we tend to have yes answers to that. So first off, my biggest pleasure there's been a lot of things that are not a pleasure, much more that has been not a pleasure about the last year and a few months than there has been pleasures. The thing that I have been most pleased about is the very fact that people are actually recognizing that digital space is space. That was not intuitive to people. I gave an Eli talk 4 years ago, 5 years, somewhere around there, and the core thesis statement was that, we're sort of migrating into digital space. Now, I'm not saying migrating in the sense that we're putting behind offline space, but we are migrating into digital space while actually, for the first time in human history, being able to migrate and be in another place at the same time, which is offline space. So that Eli talk was not received by everybody as like, oh, yes, great. The digital world is also a world. It's also a space. There were a lot of people that felt pretty defensive about that. And what do you mean it's a space? Like, digital community is not the same as offline. You can't build the same kind of connections. There were a lot of those kinds of concerns, and some of them are valid, by the way. But I feel that by necessity, people were thrust into this world that they were kind of resisting in many cases for a long time. And they did a pretty good job of building digital connections. I'm saying that even about, small synagogues without a lot of resources, far-flung community. Like, I think there are people that actually found ways to create what they themselves had said was not necessarily possible. And so my gleaning is that maybe we should take that spirit and apply it to all sorts of new kinds of thinking. Like, we happen to be thrust by necessity into this particular rapid change. There are lots of other rapid changes ideologically, geographically, demographically in Jewish life that communities are resisting, that I think if we were thrust by necessity, we'd also realize pretty quickly, oh, this isn't so bad. But so I think it's a huge deal that we've recognized that we are inhabiting space at all when we are connecting with each other on Zoom. Because once you come to that realization, it's not trivial. Once you realize that this digital space is a space, you start to ask, oh, what would we expect? So if this is like a digital community, what resources should communities have? If we knew about any Jewish community, small, medium, or large, that had no Jewish institutions or very few Jewish institutions, there'd be all sorts of national and international projects trying to serve that community. We have a 13 million-ish population Jewish community in the digital Jewish space, and the amount of resources that we have for it, even as it has drastically grown, is way, way less than what we would want it to be for that many people. So my hope is that we can continue building that. And I'm more optimistic now about that than I was, because I'm even hearing from some of the resistant people a few years ago that they've experienced themselves really magical moments of not just individual meaning, but collective meaning online. And once you've had even one of those experiences personally, the game changes for you.
Totally. We had so many skeptics going into high holidays last year. I remember, because obviously everything was going to be online and people just like, there's no way this can be meaningful. I don't think I could do an online search, et cetera. All of the things that you would expect. And then the amount of appreciation and sort of like, oh, okay, we're believers. We're here for it. And the year was not nearly as challenging Jewishly. I mean, like challenging for all of, many other reasons, but in terms of services and connecting with people and teaching classes and all of the things that people look to community to do, having that be available online actually seemed surprisingly satisfying.
I agree with what Lex is saying. I think the most interesting year in all this is going to be like 2023, because I feel like, by 2022, let's say, people can go back to the old stuff. And I think many will. Because, they feel like, oh, well, that's the real, try it out. And then the question is going to become like, how many people are going to say, you know what, it was actually better online in a lot of ways. And, I want to allow people, I want to very happily send people back to the old world for a year, because I believe that a lot of them will come back. That doesn't mean, again, they're going to abandon, like Lex is saying, doesn't mean they're going to abandon.
Is this a Rumspringa? Is this?
Yeah, it's like a Rumspringa. Yeah, no, that, they have the Amish. No, it really is, because I fundamentally believe that, I fundamentally believe that people have to go back to experience for themselves that actually there were things online that they really liked better. Otherwise, they're going to talk about it as if it wasn't so bad. That's good. Wasn't so bad. It's good. But it's not like, okay, yeah, this is really the future. And the thing about it is that I'm always really focused on saying that when we're talking about innovation, whether that's online stuff or just this world of new forms of Judaism, in the early days, it's not going to be that great. It's one thing to say, I don't want to participate in this thing because it's not good enough for what I need yet, versus this thing is bad, and I want to try to say that it shouldn't be funded, and it shouldn't be taken seriously, and it shouldn't be seen as worthy of our, communal attention and investment. And I worry that a lot of the newer things, whether it's online or offline, even people who have enjoyed it over the last year, nevertheless see it in the category of, what in the Talmud talks about as b'diavad. It's like, well, if you can't do it the right way, at least this is okay. It's not forbidden. It's not terrible. It's okay. And I don't want people to experience this as okay. I want people to experience this as an exciting opportunity. And I think in order to do that, they have to go back and experience the old way and see, what, I actually didn't like it that much back then. I had a misremembering of how of the good old days. And then I think it'll be very interesting what happens. And I think that some people, maybe the majority, are going to stay back in the old way, but more people are going to move forward into the new way than would have had COVID not happened. And I'm excited about like moving to that desert island with that larger group.
I mean, it's very interesting. I feel like you made this point early on in, an early COVID episode about how like leaving the old world and coming to the new world, meant leaving a lot of practices and throwing your tefillin overboard maybe and coming here to where like it's sort of uncharted territory and you're bushwhacking your way through. It's like the wild, wild west and everybody's sort of settling the new territory in whatever way, they can. And it turns out it's not that bad. Oh, actually, it's great. I like it better here. Like, I'm freer here. There's a lot of possibility here. And, the difference being now, of course, with this metaphor, when you had old world and new world, you took some of the old world with you, but fundamentally your body was in the new world, Mm-hmm. And now you actually have a physical body in the, in the malchut of the real world and like a digital presence and attention, you can actually split your time. You can do both. But to your point, Judaism Unbound has more congregants, so to speak, than any synagogue, right? So if you get 40,000 downloads a month, which that's just a rough estimate, right? And like 1 million downloads in 2020, that's, you guys have...
So not just in $1 million downloads since
total.
No, it's more than that, but it's about 400,000.
Yeah, 1 million.
I mean, you have a bigger community online than any synagogue, federation, political pack. Like, it's actually pretty extraordinary. And many of those people are affiliated with local in-person things, and many are also not. For many people, like, this is their way of connecting to Judaism. Is that for you? Like, what does that mean for you?
I think about the beginning of Anna Karenina, where Tolstoy writes that every happy family is the same, but every unhappy family is different, is unhappy in a different way. And I think what's important to understand about that large majority of, the folks who are not affiliated with the existing landscape is it's not like there's going to be some new silver bullet that's going to work for all of them. And so I think, what does it look like to embrace a version of Judaism that is a version of many Judaisms, that becomes this multiplicity, this kind of Wild West, this experimental laboratory. And for me, that's really exciting. And I know for other people, it's really scary and depressing. And so I think about what a future might look like in which some subset of us says, hey, like, let's really embrace that. And why I say it that way is I don't want the responsibility, and I don't think it's true to say, hey, we have all these people, it's bigger than any synagogue, it's bigger than anyone. Where should we lead them? That's not how I see this. How I see it is more like, can we find some way to make a platform where these folks can find each other? And like you and were saying earlier, no, I'm not the only one who feels this way. And I'm not the only one who, is feeling this way because I'm trans or because I use psychedelics or whatever the reason might be. That's where the Tolstoy comes in. And can we find a way to normalize this world in which, and maybe this is that connection to the smallness or the groundedness of Malchut. I actually think about the original idea of Melech, which we understand as king, but Melechs in the ancient world were actually more like what we would call a mayor or a clan chieftain. It's really small. And so maybe we can re-embrace that smallness as the new way of being Jewish, and that's the world I want to live in. And maybe there'll be this other world of big Jewish institutions, and there'll be this alternative universe of small Jewish institutions. And like, I'm not here. I don't think we're here to lead that world of the small ones. We're here maybe like you were saying earlier to say it's kosher.
Yeah, it's almost like helping people return to our tribal roots in a way, but rather than those tribes being like Shimon and Levi and Reuben, it's, all different manner of the kinds of Jewish expressions that exist. So that's beautiful.
Yeah, no, because I'm just constantly in language wordplays and stuff, something just hit me around the word melech, which is melech is zooming out. It takes the letter mem and then it backs up one letter to lamed and then it backs up another letter to kaf. So like there's a way for those who aren't really into mystic approaches like this, it's okay if you disregard this. But I think I don't mean this in like a metaphysically true sense. I just mean like it's cool that this word, okay, we're backing out from the letter mem to the previous letter before that. And I do think that that there could be an invitation through this idea of malchut built on that root to back out and really ask and to look back, right? It's backing out. It's looking backward. You used the word return just now. So I think that's maybe an invitation for us. The other thing with what you asked about, bigger congregation than anywhere in the world, I really want to emphasize, I do think that's true and I think it matters, but I want to extra emphasize it's not because we're so great. It's really not. I do think we do a good job, but like the reality is we timed the launch of our podcast really well. It was, as podcasts were growing, it was early enough in various forms of digital advertising that we could advertise an episode and it would reach a lot of people that it doesn't. I mean, there were different fortunate factors that made us sort of reach a lot of people when we did. We're not, super talented, amazing. Like this is what happens when you decide to dive into a digital community that doesn't have that much out there yet. And so if others do this, the floodgates are going to open just as much for their work. It's not just going to be us. And like, I often tell people, like, we're often in the 1 through 5 slot in like most popular Jewish podcasts, right? And like my dream in certain senses, I mean this in some ways, not others. My dream is that we're actually 10th or 15th. That like there are people with much more resources. We're 2 people. We have 1 other staff member. Like there's no reason that we should be the biggest digital Jewish podcast provider. Like in my dream world, there'd be so many rich options that we would just be one of them alongside these others. Now, there are certain like we said before with the voices we think get too much airplay. Like there's certain kinds of voices I don't really want to be in slots 1 through 10. But like I would love there to be amazing justice-driven, beautiful podcasts that are bigger than us even. And so that bigger congregation than anywhere in the world thing, it's just an invitation. It's just maybe an imperative for all of us to be thinking about our geographies differently. Like I commend you for having this podcast, right? Because what I feel, not just from Mishkan, but from even other emergent network communities is, yes, you're Mishkan Chicago, right? But like, I know a lot of people who have tuned into what you do from other places. And I don't know how you conceptualize those people, like if there's different ways you would categorize members who are in Chicago versus elsewhere. My belief about the future of Jewish life is that we're going to inhabit a world, whether this is good or bad or both, we're going to inhabit a world where like people on one end of the country are going to be deeply embedded in communities on the other end of the country because maybe they grew up there and they still feel connected to it. They haven't found it, or maybe they didn't grow up there, but just their friend goes there and they invited, like, there's nothing restricting us, nothing stopping us from going to Torah study thousands of miles away, such that, like, why would we just go to the one in our neighborhood by default? It's actually deeply exciting. And so that biggest congregation in the world thing, it means that everybody can think about what their congregation is and where the world is differently.
Wow. Well, thank you. It's very satisfying to get to just hear the two of you talk as yourselves being the interviewees, not the interviewers, because, there are times when you're interviewing people on the show You always have fascinating guests, and your comments and reflections on their ideas are also fascinating. And so to get to just spend an hour with you talking and hearing you is really fun for me, and probably for the many people who listen to your show and want a little bit more of you. Okay, so here you are. I think you guys are doing such important work. I'm so grateful for the platform you're giving to all of the people who you've shared with the Jewish community and really the world, with anybody who's interested through the podcast. It's so important, and I do think that you are changing the landscape in really important and lasting ways. Thank you.
You've been listening to Contact Chai, a podcast from Mishkan Chicago, a Jewish spiritual community and part of the Jewish Emergent Network. If you've missed the last few weeks of the Omer series in the spirituality of entrepreneurship, make sure to go back and catch our episodes about loving kindness, strength, balance, compassion, endurance, humility, and foundation setting. If you'd like to support our show, you can leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Reviews help listeners find our show, and they let us know what you think. One reviewer, Torah Diem the Well, wrote, "Invigorating and soulful. These teachings really resonate. I can't say enough about how relevant, touching, and meaningful I find all of these podcasts. Rabbi Lizzie is a soulful spiritual leader who I am so grateful to call my rabbi." Thank you, Torah Diem the Well, and I really hope I pronounced that right. This show is produced by our fabulous team at Mishkan. Editing and production of this podcast is by Hannah Rehak, administrative assistance by Zach Weinberg, and editorial oversight by Director of Communications Ashley Donahue. Find out more about Mishkan Chicago at mishkanchicago.org, where you can also make a donation. Many blessings. Kol Tuv.